are gathered here representatives of the major warring powers to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
World at War is one of the most unique games to come out in the Call of Duty franchise. That statement isn't going to be so obvious to someone who is not entirely familiar with the series. I'm looking at the Gen Alphas in the chat. Especially if you are unaware of the chronology in which these games were released. We all know that, once upon a time, Call of Duty was known as the World War II shooter franchise, and the first 3 entries in the series, while great in their own right, contributed to a growing apathy towards depictions of the Second World War in the interactive medium. I mean, between Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Brothers in Arms, and Battlefield, I think we all killed enough virtual Germans to justify a nice little getaway to San Andreas. And then, something unexpected happened.
Ready up.
This might be surprising to hear, but the release of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare wasn't really any type of calculated move on Infinity Ward's part. It wasn't based on meticulous market analysis or on surveys, it really just came down to one simple reason. They were just really fucking tired of making World War II video games. That's not hyperbole either. In the Call of Duty 4 Postmortem, published in Game Developer magazine in March of 2008, Zied, Rieke and Michael Boon of Infinity Ward said that Call of Duty 2 turned a lot of their developers off of the setting entirely. It just so happened that, by the time 2007 rolled around, most of the people that were playing these games shared a similar sentiment. It was all just sort of a happy accident, where the oversaturation in the genre eventually led everyone down the same path inadvertently. Modern Warfare wasn't the first shooter based in the modern day, but it was the one that completely redefined the genre. COD 4 becomes a bestseller, and the age of the World War II first-person shooter ends almost overnight. Most of these big franchises decide to turn their attention towards modern military settings in the years following COD 4, while Infinity Ward starts drawing up plans for a big sequel that would go on to surpass even the gargantuan success of this first new spin-off. And 1 year later, Treyarch drops World at War. Let's back up a little. After its acquisition by Activision in 2001, Treyarch's first contribution to the Call of Duty series came in the form of Call of Duty 2 Big Red 1, which coincidentally was also the game that introduced me to the franchise. Big Red 1 was a spin-off title released for the 6th console generation in late 2005, while the second, mainline game developed by Infinity Ward got the full PC release treatment as well as getting early dibs on the newly announced Xbox 360. This wouldn't be the last time that a Call of Duty game would be split into separate projects, in an effort to capitalize on older console generations which lacked the hardware needed to handle their larger scope. However, this would be the last time that Treyarch would be tasked with this role. Where Call of Duty 2 featured 3 different campaigns, taking you through distinct theaters of war in the conflict, Big Red 1 had just one. Considering the hardware limitations and the fact that Treyarch basically had to make their own game from scratch, the game performed surprisingly well, selling a total of around 2.7 million copies, compared to the 5.9 million of the flagship title. It must have, at the very least, outdone the expectations set by Activision, because mere months after the game's release, Treyarch would get the chance to develop the next mainline title in the Call of Duty franchise. And they did not waste this opportunity. The fact that Call of Duty 3 came out to any sort of success, let alone outselling Infinity Ward's previous title by around 1.3 million copies, whilst also being the only main series title to not get a PC release, is somewhat of a miracle. For context, Activision, upon seeing the success of this developing franchise, decided that they wanted a new game as quickly as possible to compete with the Medal of Honor series, which in its own right was also releasing some absolute bangers. They turned to Infinity Ward asking for a new game within the following year, who promptly laughed and said they need at least 2 years to bring out anything of good enough quality. They then turned to Treyarch, who, when asked the same question, said, "Fuck it. Why not?" In just 8 short months, Call of Duty 3 was complete in the tail end of 2006. The game rated well amongst critics overall, though the short development time did have a toll on its developers. Even with the recent merger between Treyarch and Grey Matter Studios, making a AAA game in that short amount of time is no easy feat. Talking in VideoGamer, Treyarch's senior producer, Noah Heller, this is literally the only picture I was able to find of him, mused about what the game could have been like if they had more time to further test and polish its levels. Nevertheless, we can assume that the sales Call of Duty 3 was able to generate made Activision very happy, since, shortly after its release, Treyarch and Infinity Ward would sign a contract which would put them in a 2-year release rotation for the series going forward. And the rest, as they say, is history. The release of World at War might make a lot more sense with this added context. Whereas Infinity Ward felt like they got everything they could out of the World War II setting, eager to set off on a brand new endeavor, Treyarch was far from satisfied. In an alternate universe where they were given more time to work on their project, it's entirely possible that they would have followed the path of Infinity Ward, moving to the modern military shooter market, if not a different setting entirely. But now, with a full 2-year cycle, they were finally going to have the time to release their definitive World War II experience. Even so, the modern warfare trend would already be set in motion by the time this new game would be ready to ship. If they wanted to grab the attention of the average gaming Joe, they would have to do something really unique. Judging by a lot of the pre-release coverage of World at War, it's clear Treyarch knew that releasing a new World War II shooter after the success of Modern Warfare put them at a disadvantage. Articles and adverts released months before the game's launch often focused on this, stating that it was believed that the series' return to the conflict after Call of Duty 3 was unexpected. Treyarch knew that they would have to offer a new perspective on the setting if they wanted to achieve even the slightest modicum of relevancy. And to their credit, the few details they shared coming up to the November release date were effective in portraying this new direction. For one, they had a flamethrower in the game. They really wanted you to know that they had a flamethrower in the game. And yeah, it was fucking rad. But the game clearly stood out from its contemporaries in 2 distinct ways. First was the introduction of the Pacific Theater, and consequently the Imperial Japanese Army. This perked the ears of a lot of people. The Pacific wasn't completely unexplored in the genre, but there was definitely a gap in the market there that Treyarch could exploit if they played their cards right. The only other big-budget shooter series that attempted to depict this side of the war in a single-player campaign was Medal of Honor. Out of the 2 games that featured the setting, I only played Rising Sun, and honestly, I remember not really liking it all that much. This would be the first Call of Duty game to give you a break from killing Germans for 8 hours straight, and Treyarch devs seemed very excited about it in interviews.
It's not just about, those jungle environments and those locations, and we'll show you all that stuff in the trailer, but it's about the new Imperial Japanese Army that you're going to be fighting. And they were just a different kind of fighting force than anything anyone had ever seen, and we've been working on the gameplay around that. It's really fresh, it's really exciting, it's really new.
The other change was probably the one that really sold a lot of people on the game. A design decision that was, to a certain extent, made possible or enhanced by the inclusion of the Pacific Theater. World at War was going dark. Here's the thing about World War II games from the early 2000s. A lot of them were going for a very similar type of experience, that being your granddad's classic war films from around the 60s and 70s in video game form. It's not hard to see why this worked so well in the early days of these types of games. It was quite rare to play something based in this setting that didn't make the world's deadliest conflict look like a jolly old time with the boys, similar to how some of those old movies did. The only game releasing around this time that I can think of that tried to buck this trend was Brothers in Arms, the success of which proved that explorations of the darker sides of warfare had a lot of merit for the medium. The keyword that reveals why Brothers in Arms, and later World at War, were able to see such success within the genre is expectation. Noah Heller and Farrelly went into quite a lot of detail about this in that VideoGamer article I mentioned earlier. saying that the reason behind the success of COD 4 was the change in expectations it created for the modern military setting, and that with World at War, Treyarch intended to do the same thing. If these magazine spots, or the many trailers that would later release for the game, weren't enough to convince you that this was going to be a very different take on the World War II genre, then the game itself certainly would. Right from the moment you first booted it up. I could live to be 100 and still be able to recognize the screeching intro that greets you into the main menu of World at War. It's like the gates of hell themselves grinding as they open to reveal the visceral horrors of war that lie in store. Horrors that the game is keen on showing you right from the beginning of the first mission. Semper Fi starts the game off in quite the brutal fashion. The player character from the US Marines side of the campaign, Miller, was captured by the Japanese along with his team whilst out on a reconnaissance mission on the island of Makin, in the Makin Atoll. You're interrogated for information, and are quickly shown that the Japanese really want to make their debut in the series stand out. You watch your comrade take a lit cigarette to the eye before having his throat slit right in front of you. Just as it starts to look like you might soon face the same fate, you're saved by none other than RAWK. I knew his voice sounded familiar.
Consecutive! C-Q-C!
I still think this is a great intro. It's maybe a little bit too on the nose with the whole tone thing, like it's really trying to convince you about how different and edgy the game is going to be. But not only can you not really blame it for trying to differentiate itself from the other games in this genre with its big bulging balls, but this whole sequence is actually pretty vanilla compared to some of the other stuff that happens later on in the game, even just in the gameplay side of things.
Oh my god!
Setting the tone early was important for Treyarch, as we've seen in some of the developer interviews I've shown, and this opening scene definitely stands out. Like, I'm genuinely trying to remember how the first mission in Modern Warfare started as I'm writing this part of the script, and I can't remember if the game begins with the cargo ship or the shoot house. The latter makes more sense, but the ship would also make for a strong introduction. This, however, was much easier to remember.
Go to hell.
Having said that, my experience with the US Marine side of the campaign ended up being rather underwhelming. And even though Semper Fi is successful in establishing the game's overall tone, it also exposes a big flaw. After being freed by roadblocks and fighting some Japanese soldiers as you make your way inland, this happens.
Check it out.
Looks like a temple or some shit.
Hold your ground! Hold your ground!
Knowing now how much of the interviews, promos, and teasers for the game focused on the new Pacific Theater and the Japanese army coming up to release, I can't help but wonder if the game doesn't, for lack of a better term, blow its load too early. There was a lot of talk surrounding how different the Imperial faction behavior was going to be compared to the German AI of the previous games. Mentions were made of having to develop whole new styles of combat and tactics to replicate how the Japanese conducted warfare across the Pacific. They had good reasons to be excited about this. The Japanese had never really been represented like this in other World War II games prior to this, and I do remember being surprised by what they were able to do in the game back when it first released. But the problem lies in the fact that the Japanese AI in World at War empties almost its entire bag of tricks within just this first level. Within just 6 minutes of gameplay. We see booby traps followed by an ambush, banzai charges, as well as a group of Japanese soldiers feigning death as a setup for another ambush.
Ambush!
Sniping from treetops and hiding in tall grass are knocked out in the very next mission, with soldiers hiding in foxholes being the one mechanic that's saved until the last couple of missions in the campaign. That's a nice automatic Arasaka, by the way. Man's got that new tech. Now, it's hard to say too much regarding the in-depth development of the game with any real conviction, as information on this subject is very scarce. I can imagine, for example, a scenario where this was something that was out of Treyarch's control. It kind of has that distinct smell of one of those publisher boardroom meeting memes. It may be the case that Activision stepped in and demanded that all of the new marketable shit that Treyarch was cooking up had to be shown off as early in the campaign as possible. Classic corporate meddling type beat. Of course, this could also just be how Treyarch intended the game to begin with. Either way, I think this decision was a bit short-sighted looking back. The Marine campaign could really have benefited a lot from progressively introducing new tactics throughout its 8-mission runtime, because even with all the new AI behavior, the missions start to suffer from the usual complacency I feel with most of these other COD games. I noticed everything I needed to look out for with the new Japanese units within the first 20 minutes, and then it just becomes a mostly mindless shooter thereafter. On the other hand, the game could have started like this. I have to wonder how the game would have fared critically if Vendetta was the mission that kicked everything off. This is already one of the most unique and memorable missions in the entire series, rivaling the likes of Infinity Ward's All Gillied Up. And it achieved that feat while also going back to fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front. With such a strong opening, it might have been good to let you play a couple of missions on the Soviet side first. It would have been just as effective at introducing you to the new thematic direction the game was going to portray. I mean, you wake up in a fountain in Stalingrad amongst dozens of dead Soviet soldiers and witness what can generously be referred to as a coup de grace. Over the next few missions, the game would trick you into thinking that you're getting more of the same old, at least as far as the gameplay is concerned. More Germans to mow down across the Eastern European theatre, only to hit you with a massive vibe check later with the Japanese and their completely different tactics. Attention spans were a little longer back then. I'm sure we could have waited like 2 missions before getting to see some new stuff. Treyarch didn't reveal much about the Eastern Front missions prior to the game's release. There was definitely going to be a campaign set in the theater, but that's as much as they were willing to say at the time. This could have been the better way to go with the game because, in my opinion, the Soviet campaign is also the stronger one of the two overall. The Marine missions feel like they have the most in common with older Call of Duty campaigns. There is no real compelling narrative that ties the missions to each other, other than roughly following the timeline of events from the actual conflict. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the couple of attempts the game makes at making the player care about your squad mates utterly fail. Sullivan's death in the second mission was so fucking stupid that the combat effectiveness of the US Marines actually went up the moment that sword went through his stomach.
We're all numb by Sullivan's death. We just never saw it coming. We just never saw it coming.
Yeah, me neither, buddy. I too run towards noises I hear behind doors. Matter of fact, I make sure to do that when I know there's katana-wielding weebs running around spamming left-click at anything that moves. Going back to these older games, it's often hard to put yourself back into the perspective of what you may have expected from a game based only on the experience you had with games released prior. I found this article by Keith Stewart, published in The Guardian, to be an interesting read for getting a sense of what people may have thought about this campaign around the time it came out. He gives the game praise in a lot of aspects, but does also describe these moments in the campaign as being awkward. It is nice to have my feelings validated sometimes, because in the 5 Marine missions following the one described in this article, nothing really piqued my interest. Not until the game tries to make you care again with a Mass Effect 3 style choose your ending sequence. Do you save RAWK or Polonsky? Motherfucker, RAWK every time. If you save him, we can pretend that he goes on to become Big Boss in some scuffed MGS timeline. In some ways, the American campaign was cursed to have an unsatisfactory ending from the very beginning. As dark and edgy as it wanted to be, it probably would have been too far to put the player on board the Enola Gay in its last mission to put a concrete full stop to the story. Although, can you fucking imagine? I mean, have you seen the ending to Black Ops? It's so fucking funny.
Wait till you see the... No.
The Eastern Front, however, had a much better chance.
You can make it, my friend. You always survive.
I did not expect to enjoy myself coming back to the Russian campaign in this game as much as I did. In some ways, it's really more of the same. Quiet moments of retrospection are rare. You're far too busy killing Germans and pushing them back to Berlin to be worried about any of that soy shit. However, the thing it does have going for it is that I feel like it's actually trying to say something throughout its runtime. There's undeniably a theme here that underlines everything that you experience through the eyes of Dimitri. It's nothing insane, it's not exactly going to change the way you look at life after playing it, but the campaign is built around this one fundamental theme to make it a much more cohesive experience when compared to the Marine side. That theme is revenge. Putting the player in Stalingrad right from the get-go is a great decision if you intend to explore a theme like revenge. This was the largest and deadliest urban battle in history where millions of people lost their lives. It's also what most historians believe to be the point of no return for the Germans in World War II, where the Soviets began to take back all of their occupied territory and then some. You don't really need to know any of this information prior to playing the game though. I know I didn't the first time I played it, because Vendetta lets you experience the brutality of Stalingrad in 1942 firsthand. I mentioned how the mission starts earlier, but its intensity comes up again and again throughout the entire mission. The game shows you that your head could be snugly sitting in the crosshairs of a German sniper sitting in any of these buildings around you, ready to end your life without even realizing what happened. At one point, you're caught after escaping a burning building and are almost executed by immolation. That's pretty fucking hardcore. It makes it so that once you do eventually have the weaponry and manpower to back you up, you're not even going to question the amount of Germans you're killing by the end of the game. You've seen how brutal they can be when they're on the offensive, so you never feel any remorse. Every single other mission in the Russian campaign after Vendetta has you progressively pushing the Germans back to Berlin. You're never on the defensive from this point on. From the Silo Heights to the Reichstag, you spend every moment enacting your revenge. The thing about revenge though is that oftentimes it can get ugly.
Make sure they are all dead.
World at War tried its hand at a few player choice moments. It's something that has never really been done in the series up to this point, and in my opinion, they don't really work in the Marine campaign. The aforementioned example in that Guardian article is only really somewhat cool if you choose to shoot the survivors, because I guess then you can wonder about what could have happened if you had to let them suffer. Only to realize on the second playthrough that, seconds later, they just drop dead in a default animation. I think we can forget about the final choice in the last mission. I really don't think I need to go over why it's bad. The Russian campaign does things a little differently. For the most part, that revenge theme is only experienced through what Dimitri sees, and not through the actions he takes. For the most part, you are just an observer of the numerous acts of senseless, unnecessary violence that happen throughout the campaign. It's not until later that you actually get to make a choice. In the mission Eviction, we see a role reversal. Where it was the Germans patrolling the streets of Stalingrad finishing off wounded Russian soldiers, the game now lets you take that same role on the streets of Berlin. A building comes crashing down, incapacitating dozens of them, and you have a lot of time to go through them one by one and do the deed if you want to. Right after this, you find more German soldiers trying to surrender down at a metro entrance. The game gives you two options. You can either show them mercy by shooting them, or stand back and watch as they are burned alive with Molotov cocktails by the other Soviet soldiers around you. The actions you take here do nothing to change anything that happens in the rest of the campaign. Shooting them or letting them burn alive results in the exact same outcomes. What it does do, however, is show you which of the angel and devil on your shoulders has been more influential on you throughout the course of your campaign. You are offered two voices on the events of the campaign, through the interactions between Reznov and Chernov. One of these voices is much louder than the other, though what they are saying is a lot more nuanced. Reznov is there with you from the very beginning of the story. Without his help, you probably would have died not too far away from that fountain you woke up in. He makes his intentions clear from the very first time you see him, and if you didn't hear it then, he'll repeat it again many times.
Do what I say, and we can avenge this massacre.
Sergeant Reznov, you seem to relish in the slaughter.
I've seen my friends die in front of me at the hands of this world. They deserve everything they get, and more.
He's intent on making every German soldier pay for what they have done to his people and country. Time and time again, he will command you and your other fellow soldiers to take immoral actions in the name of revenge. Chernov, on the other hand, gets nowhere near as much speaking time. He's the only soldier you see on the Russian side that seems to have any sort of reservation about the conduct of the Red Army, commenting on the many atrocities you witness as you make your way through Germany. And the few times he gets passionate about it, he's ignored.
This is not war. This is murder.
This is how you win the war, Chernobyl!
This is murder. A rockets are tearing the city apart.
Get inside!
Chernov is like a tether trying to pull the player out of the game to smack some sense into him about what's happening. Like, hey, I know you've done nothing but kill people for the past few hours in this game, but this isn't the same thing. This is what makes the one decision you do get to make worth something. Who are you more sympathetic to? The person who wants his enemies to suffer the same fate that they dealt to his friends, or the person who wants to be above it all? Do you realize in this moment that you're really not much better than them? Or do you embrace that fact?
Dimitri, it is your choice. You should have shot them, Joe. It's only cruel to prolong an animal's suffering.
Of course, the tragic irony is that even if you do side with the pacifist Chernov, he ends up dying at the steps of the Reichstag anyway. This would ordinarily be a good place to conclude my overall thoughts on the campaign. However, there is one side to World at War which I absolutely love that I really need to talk about. I mentioned it briefly at the start of the second chapter in this video, but I think I would be doing a disservice if I didn't give this the praise that it deserves, due to how much it elevates the overall experience of the game. I'm talking, of course, about the music. The composer behind the score of World at War is a man by the name of Sean Murray. It's not the one you're thinking of. This Sean Murray has a surprising amount of composition credits under his belt, having worked on many films and TV shows from 1986 up until the present day. In all honesty, I'd never heard of any of the films he's been credited under before. The vast majority of them don't even have Wikipedia entries, and the few that do show that a lot of these films were received rather poorly upon release. The most popular project I was able to find that Murray was involved in seems to be Season 2 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so shout out to the buff. Murray's first video game project was 2003's true crime Streets of LA, starting a relationship with Activision which would see him composing the soundtracks for 4 more of their games thereafter, up to Call of Duty Black Ops. Unfortunately, it seems like he's for the most part finished with composing music for video games, with his final credit being a music kit for Counter-Strike Global Offensive dated to 2014. It's a shame because the 2 games I've actually played that he's composed music for really stand out as having some of the most unique scores in the first-person shooter genre. World at War is no exception. There are a lot of things you could say about this soundtrack. To start with, the music featured in the 2 campaigns, while having some similarities, are also distinctly different from one another in a few key aspects. Murray detailed the different goals he had in mind behind the creation of both the American and Russian campaign scores in an article posted on Music for Games in 2008, and these are well reflected in the finished product. For the Marine side, for instance, Murray talked about wanting to represent the effect that the Japanese had on the American psyche in the Pacific Theater. The battles you witness during gameplay between the American and Japanese forces is elevated by the battles that happen within the soundtrack itself. One minute there is a heavy emphasis on traditional Japanese instruments, with firm taiko drum rhythms driving you through many of the campaign's combat sections. Oftentimes these are supplemented with dark bassy synths which do a good job of creating that foreign alien sound that Murray was going for. The synths used often jump out at you unexpectedly, sometimes they can sound odd and out of place, which is a great auditory analog for the strange, unexpected tactics the Japanese employ against you in battle. Then other times, especially towards the end of a mission when you complete your objectives, the tone changes, with triumphant brass instruments that proclaim your superiority in battle. There's an excellent example of this right at the start of the second mission, Little Resistance. You're sent out in a landing craft to take part in this massive beach assault, in a display of the sheer industrial domination that the Americans held over the Axis powers. You see dozens of other landers at either side. You see a ship launching rockets towards the shore as planes fly overhead dropping bombs. All as the soundtrack swells up into this dramatic crescendo. Only to just as quickly deteriorate as the landing goes to shit. A shakuhachi slowly invades the orchestra as this happens, resisting the American theme, just as the Japanese resist against the invasion. It's a masterclass in incorporating music into the events taking place on the screen. The score in the Russian campaign utilizes similar ideas, though the end result sounds distinctly different. It's not just brass instruments that represent the Red Army. The vast majority of the soundtrack here makes use of strings mixed with some traditional Slavic instruments, most notably the gadulka and balalaika. But the moments that really stand out, like the brass sections in the other campaign, make heavy use of choir and operatic singing. The solo singing performances give the music in the Russian campaign a much more visceral, desperate feeling, which juxtaposes well with its heightened brutality and the themes it's going for. While the choir sections tend to show up during moments when you see the Russians pushing the Germans back, making undeniable progress, pushing you onwards to victory. If there is one thing that really separates the two scores from one another though, it's got to be what Murray called the Angel of Death. The siren that calls out to you from the beginning in Stalingrad all the way to Berlin, calling you to come and meet your death. This is still, to this day, one of the most bone-chilling performances in any video game soundtrack I've ever heard. The way this track is composed evokes nothing but pure despair. It's a fantastic way of signaling the events to come. It's no secret at this point what the siren is saying here. It tells you exactly where you're going to be headed right from the start of the game. You're going to die with the city of Berlin. Of course, this doesn't happen, and there are hints of this as you progress through the campaign. Reznov will remark on your ability to cheat death on numerous occasions. It may be the case that Chernov took your place in this fate. Maybe it was Dmitri who was destined to die at the steps of the Reichstag, managing to postpone it on this occasion, even if death would eventually catch up to him a few years later in the events of Black Ops. Everything I've mentioned in this chapter so far is pretty much universally praised by players and critics alike. There was a lot of cooperation between Sean Murray and the developers at Treyarch that went into conceptualizing a coherent vision of how the gameplay and music could interact to complement each other. The result was not only one of the most unique soundtracks for a single-player campaign released at the time, but also one that manages to stand the test of time. Even if, throughout my revisits to World at War, I had some moments where I got a bit bored of the slightly dated gameplay it offers, I cannot say the same about the soundtrack. That being said, there is this one thing about the score which has had some criticism. The only real criticisms I have heard or read about World at War's music is in regards to its use of electric guitar, which I always found to be unconvincing. Take that Keith Stewart Guardian article for example. During key set pieces, pounding rock music plays in the background, a nod no doubt to the tastes of the game's target demographic.
Teenage American males.
To them, it's no doubt blood-pumping, adrenaline-boosting stuff. But it is also willfully incongruous, distorting the game's reality in a fundamentally exploitative way. This is a bit of a nitpick, and I'm not sure if this rock music meme comes from a place of ignorance or from some other place entirely, but it comes back up again in my next example, so I want to mention it now. Just because a guitar is present doesn't automatically make something rock music. To call the guitar tracks in World at War rock music, or hard rock guitar riffs, is completely disingenuous as to the purpose it serves in the actual score. Someone reading this who has never played the game before will go away thinking that World at War starts playing fucking AC/DC as you're running around mowing down soldiers in the Pacific, which is miles apart from the darker industrial metal sound that the game is going for here. Which, for the record, I think achieves the goal of portraying the brutality of the conflict. Saying that these parts of the score were included purely to satisfy the tastes of teenage boys is a pretty cynical take, and it undermines any creative process that might actually go into such a decision. Murray detailed his idea behind the structure of the soundtrack in that Music for Games article, saying, "I try to musically follow closely the state of mind of the soldiers as they are subject to more and more violence. This psychological approach gave us a great amount of musical latitude. More on that in a minute." I'm about to beat some allegations now, because it's time to critique a part of a Face Full of Eyes video. I know, didn't see that coming either. In his video, Aesthetics of World at War, he also talks about how he didn't like the use of guitars in the game's soundtrack.
And this model works up to the point you start to get the sense you're playing Doom or Wolfenstein. Hard rock riffs in this game didn't really work for me and felt tone deaf and inappropriate, historically and aesthetically.
It would be fine if he left it saying that the guitars just didn't work for him, but I find the justifications he gives to be unconvincing. I am not of the opinion that if you set a game in a certain historical setting, and you want to make music for that game, you should only use instruments and soundscapes that were common around this setting. Sometimes, modern music can do a much better job of portraying something that the contemporary music of the period cannot. I think that the soundtrack of World at War is a great example of why nothing should be off limits. Personally, the industrial sections of the score do not glorify the violence in the game for me, like the criticisms seem to suggest based on calling it
rock music.
Quite the opposite. They outline its brutality and absurdity. The player characters witness violence and horrors in the game that are so unimaginable that their state of mind in those moments can only be expressed by instruments and a genre of music that didn't even exist at the time. I also think that this sound goes well with the conflict just based on the highly industrialized nature of the Second World War. EA Sports, it's in the name.
The choice to include hard rock guitar riffs comes off as tone deaf no matter how you look at it. This isn't Doom or Mafia 3, and levels that juxtapose distorted guitars and carnage feel really off to me. The same goes for that shriveled scream that cries out "die" each time the avatar gets killed.
If you don't think that distorted guitars and carnage go well together, then I just feel like you haven't really explored a lot of guitar music. Take it from a degenerate music graduate who's been obsessed with the instrument since the age of 11. But even beyond that, I can easily think of one example of a game setting where I imagine he would actually appreciate the juxtaposition of actual hard rock guitar riffs and the visceral carnage similar to that found in World at War. Just look to shooters based in the Vietnam War. It feels like it's against the law not to have CCR or the Rolling Stones in your soundtrack if you make a game based on that conflict. To me, the two examples provided, Doom and Mafia 3, sound completely different to anything present in the soundtrack of World at War, and I have to wonder if all guitar music just sounds exactly the same to some people. I wouldn't really be surprised. It's strange that the presence of guitars is where so many people draw the line, but the synths used in the game get off scot-free. Surely those could go under the same category of being tone-deaf historically and aesthetically. Obviously, to resume the glazing streak, while I found a lot to disagree with this section, it's a great video overall. It feels a bit dirty to criticize a video that was made over 3 years ago, but it helped me make my point. You can find it in the description below, along with all of the references I've used up to this point. Something I have heard rumors of, though wasn't able to confirm with any real evidence, was that Treyarch considered the Eastern Front campaign of World at War to basically just be filler. The Pacific Theater, which they spent a great deal of effort advertising prior to release, was supposedly where most of the attention went during development. If anyone would be able to find evidence for this, I would like to see it. I don't know if I trust these claims for two reasons. The first lies in the very fact that they went out of their way to keep as much of it a secret as possible. Now, granted, this could be used as evidence to suggest that they didn't really think much of it, focusing on the shiny new US Marine campaign because A, that setting was such a big deal for the series, and B, that's where the vast majority of their effort went into. However, my second reason for why I don't think the Soviet campaign was filler is that simply too much effort went into its creation for this to be the case. The way everything comes together, from the music to the story and gameplay, all suggests a clear creative vision shared between all of the departments involved, which is surprisingly something I find is a bit lacking in what was supposed to be the main draw for the game. The campaign in World at War is flawed, but it's still such a unique experience compared to any other World War II single-player game that, like a distant siren, it nonetheless manages to drag me back in once in a while. Before I end this video, there are a couple of loose ends I want to tidy up with World at War, where I don't necessarily have that much to say about them. For instance, it's worth mentioning that World at War was the first game in the series where you could complete the entire campaign with your friends in co-op, a feature that has only been done one other time since in Black Ops 3. I have only limited experience with the cooperative mode because I was like the only kid I knew around my age that played this game on PC, but I definitely don't have any bad memories from it. If anything, it seems like a bit of a missed opportunity not adding a co-op mode for the campaigns of any of the future games except one. I do remember having a lot of fun in World at War's multiplayer mode though. At least, I remember those times more fondly than I remember playing Modern Warfare's multiplayer, even if that game ended up being the far more popular and influential one. The multiplayer for the two games really wasn't that different from one another in a lot of ways. The general gameplay was quite similar down to the perk and killstreak system, though World at War did boast some new technical features, specifically with the audio. Apparently, Treyarch implemented a new occlusion technology into their engine that made certain audios sound different depending on what objects surrounded the player. You could tell, for example, if there was a player walking around behind a wall based on how muffled the sound of the footsteps was. Which is great and all, but it's a shame that all of this work got lost amongst endless accusations of sound whoring. There is one more side to World at War that I left until last intentionally, because the game also does the exact same thing. Many of us youngsters received a massive shock upon finishing the game's campaign for the first time, because if you sat through the ending credits, the game had one more trick up its sleeve. Even though COD Zombies has kind of been ran into the ground as of late, it's easy to forget just how much of a dub this was for Treyarch, especially considering how it was just sort of a spur-of-the-moment addition to the game near the end of development. In all fairness, I think the mode really saw its glory days in Treyarch's next Call of Duty game, Black Ops. At least, that's when it really grabbed me and pretty much everyone I know. But World at War gets credit for the blueprint. Nacht der Untoten, though simple in design, is still fun to go back to. But most of the additional maps added in DLC still I think remain some of the better maps in the series, especially Der Riese and Verrückt. In many ways, Zombies is a symbol of a bygone era, the type of risk that not many AAA game developers would be willing, or even allowed, to pursue today. So even if it's lost some of that charm now, I think it's worth remembering where this mode got started. World at War was something truly special. In a period that witnessed a mass exodus away from the single-player World War II experience, it nonetheless managed to recapture our attention to the setting by offering a new perspective, by going against our expectations. A small amount of games would still dabble with the World War II shooter genre before the end of the decade. After the release of the multiplayer-only 1943 in 2009, Battlefield would go on to ride the Modern Warfare tide well into the 2010s. Brothers in Arms would sadly be dropped entirely after 2008, never to be seen again. And Medal of Honor would basically just fucking implode under pressure. High-budget World War II shooters have attempted to make a comeback within the last decade. Call of Duty has made 2 such attempts in the form of the very creatively titled World War II, as well as Vanguard 4 years later in 2021. These games did not perform as well as some may have expected. I haven't played either of them. I've seen a lot of memes though.
Do you speak Japanese?
So I can only go by reviews I have seen, as well as Steam and Metacritic scores. Activision would try to pin the disappointing sales of Vanguard on the fact that it was set in the Second World War. But there was real hype upon the announcement of World War II back in 2017. The market for these games still exists. The problem lies in something completely different. If you haven't played COD World War II, you might nonetheless be familiar with this one infamous, fucking ridiculous cutscene that happens in the game's single-player campaign. Otherwise, all you have to do is watch the release trailers for these last 2 Call of Duty titles based in this setting to understand what the problem is. Sledgehammer Games is trying to make those old war movie experiences again. Something that was already on the way out by the mid-2000s. Something that Treyarch realized they should abandon all the way back in 2008 if they wanted to be successful. World at War may be outdated in some of its gameplay, it may look a bit outdated at times, and it may not be everyone's cup of tea. But one thing you cannot take away from World at War is just how unique it is.
I want you to subscribe to me
Scav Merchant Hub
on YouTube. Thank you, cringe.